Hello there, welcome back to another painting session. And in this painting session I'm going to be painting Derek from The Walking Dead All Out War. And here is Derek primed and ready for a paint job. So start one, or part one, not start one. I'm going to start with the skin tones. As always, I'm going to start with a base coat of Kislev Flesh. I'm going to speed the process up a little bit on this to try to streamline a little bit of my paintings. So yeah, hopefully you'll enjoy sort of just going through some of the speedy points and some of the bits that I'm doing. If you haven't already, on my channel I have a series of shorts, and I'm going to continue doing a lot of different shorts as well, where I don't need to do the voiceovers and I can just show you little snippets and little clues and little bits and tips and things in the way that I paint. So hopefully that will help you guys with a little bit of a like sort of a tutorial side of things. And apologies in advance as well that I haven't been quite as active online lately due to with the lockdowns ending and going back to work and things like that. I've had a lot more to do, so apologies with that. So once we've done our base coat, we're then going to go in and use a shade on top, and then once the shade is dried like normal, we're going to go back up with our base coat. So I'm going to go back into the Kislev Flesh and just pick out the details and highlight the face from there. Now once we've started and once we pick up the details, we're also going to add a highlight tone as well. The good thing with Derek, this miniature, is that he's got quite a lot of different creases around his face. So he's got a few lines across the forehead, a few creases down his cheeks and things like that, add into the character and add into the overall look of the miniature, which is great. So what you want to try and do is just pick out those raised points like so, without going too much or without going into the gaps, into the recesses, into the areas where the shade has dried. This will give you a really good depth to your miniature. Yeah, which should give you a really good depth. Now in this one, what we're going to do is I'm going to use a few different inks. So if you like your inks, and you've used a few inks, then this is just going to help to boost and bring up a little bit more of that that vibrancy and that colour and that texture out of the paints that we're using. Because with inks, when you add a little bit to the mixture, you get a little bit more vibrancy. So you kind of highlight without needing to overly highlight, or so I've learned. The more that you use it, the better you become. Inks are really good for that sort of vibrancy because they do make the colour underneath sort of stand out, or the colour you mix it with really stand out. So it kind of makes your models, it kind of gives your models a really nice sort of vibrant pop. If you're not comfortable using inks, or if you don't have inks, or if you don't want to use the inks, then I normally do a few different paint styles and a few different painting techniques. And instead of using the ink, you could use a Citadel Flayed One Flesh on this one. So you could mix the Flayed One Flesh and the Kislev Flesh together and you'd get a really nice sort of colour tone. But for this, with the inks, I'm just going to try to build that vibrancy. So again, we're just going to catch on to the very edges, or the very tip highlights, so that it creates that vibrancy and that amazing depth to the model. So once the skin is done and the skin is dried, then you're going to move on and just kind of paint up all of the different colours on the miniature then. So starting with the shirt, because the shirt is a little bit more difficult to get to, or rather it's going to be a little bit messy, we're going to paint in this way first, because it's always easier to paint the underneath harder to reach areas and then the higher up areas a little bit later. So for the shirt I'm using a khaki from Vallejo. You could use a Zandri Dust from Citadel, it'll do the same job. And then for the jeans, I'm going to use an Imperial Blue from Vallejo as well. And again, if you want to use Citadel, you can use sort of like your favourite blue on this. Maybe like a McCrag blue or something like that would be equally as cool. So yeah, it's just about finding the paints that you're more comfortable with and your favourite kinds of paints. Don't forget to make sure that your paints have got a little bit of sort of like water, or a flow improver or something like that, just to make sure that your paints are thinned down enough that they don't overdo your model. So that you don't want to put too much paint in and end up losing much of the detail. So for his leather jacket, we're going to move on to a German grey. If you've watched any of my other videos, you'd know that I don't like to paint a direct flat black onto a miniature like this. Normally it's because black is a little bit more too extreme, so once you go into sort of like painting a really flat black colour, it can be hard to highlight, or to highlight it, it tends to be more extreme on the edges. So for this we're using a German grey because it's a dark colour but without being too black. That way then, that when we highlight it and we bring those colours back up, it shouldn't be it shouldn't look too extreme. It should be able to paint it up quite nicely. Also just add a little bit of that onto the gun as well, onto his pistol. I'm going to use a Vallejo Dark Rust across the belt. It's one of my favourite base coats, so that then we can paint a lighter colour on top. Again, if you use a Citadel, you could use a Dryad Bark for this, that will do the same thing. And just be careful with the belt because it can be a little bit tricky getting into those bits and without painting on top of the khaki that we've already done. The cool thing we're doing the base areas like this is because we're going to shade these in a moment with a like a shade or a wash or anything like that. You don't have to be too precise or too exact. The more precise you are at this stage, the better it looks a little later, because then there's less fixing to do. So once you get your if you can paint sort of a lot more clean at this stage, or a lot more precise at this stage, then you have less to fix, which means that you've got more time to put into making like your highlights and things like that stand out more. And for the last part of the base colours, I'm just going to add a little bit of silver onto the belt buckle here. So for this one, Citadel Lead Belcher or a Vallejo Gunmetal would do, that's great. And once we've done the base coats, then we're just going to go across it with a nice shade or wash, or whichever word you choose to describe this. So I'm using a Citadel Null Nile with this, and I've just added a small drop of water just to make sure that it doesn't sit too much in areas that I don't want. So it's just a slight bit of water, just a little bit on the brush, just to create a little bit more flow on the way the wash moves and where it sits. There's nothing worse than putting a wash onto your miniature and it just pooling in the one area that you don't want it to. So yeah, I've just added a little bit just to create a little bit more flow with this. And again, that's something that the more you practice, the better you get with. So now that all of that is done, and once the base colours have dried, we've already got a decent set of, or a decent sort of like mid-tone that's now dried down to a darker tone because the shade has brought that down. So we're just going to rebuild those back up, and we're going to start again with the most difficult areas, so things like the shirt. So we're going back to that khaki colour, and I'm just going to paint the khaki up on all of the raised points. I'm going to try to leave where the shade has sat in the recessed areas again, so creating those folds. And by painting this way, I'm trying to keep the paintbrush and the paint moving in the same direction, so you kind of see that I'm going across the shirt, and that way again it's kind of creating to the dynamism of the pose and creating a little bit more sort of like illusion of folds and things like that. So from there then we're going to use the khaki that I've used, but I'm using a bone white with this one. So this is a cream white. And I'm just using a 50-50 just to create a little bit of a highlight to that khaki, and then we're just going to try to catch the most extreme areas. So again, we're going to paint those lines in, and again we're just going to try to leave a few gaps so that it creates the element and the illusion of those folds, like so. And this is the area where you want to try to be as precise as possible. Take your time, really enjoy it, because the more time you put into those brush strokes, the more detail it looks like on your miniature. So mentioning earlier that I was using an ink, for this we're using the titanium white ink, and as you see I've got two pools here. One is using one small dropper of white, which is on the right, and the left hand side one is using two small droppers of the white. And what we're doing is, this is the German grey that we used on the jacket, and then it's one dropper on the right for a slight highlight, and two droppers on the left for a higher highlight again. And so when I mentioned about the vibrance, we're just using that titanium white now, we're just using that ink to build the colour back up. So it's still staying as grey, but we're not going for like a crazy extreme edge highlight just yet. What we're doing is we're slowly building that colour back up from the base colour. Okay, so you don't have to be too knowledgeable or too extreme with it, you know, it's all trial and error. It's just a case of try it, see what works for yourself. For me, I'm using this Daleroni ink, which is the titanium white, and I found that I use this to do a lot of highlighting with a lot of different paints now. Once you start getting used to it, it becomes sort of second nature and you use it quite a lot. If you don't want to use the ink though, you could mix that with a small bit of white from a normal paint. So if you're using your you know, Citadel, you could put a small bit of white scar instead of the titanium white from the ink, and you could do it that way and just build that colour back up to a colour that you're comfortable with and a colour that you think will stand out quite a lot. Now what you'll notice with this, because I didn't want the colour to go too extreme, I've actually watered it down quite a bit, so I've kind of made a little bit of a glaze out of it. And the reason for that is because I want it to highlight, but I don't want it to take over the base colour. I want that base colour to show through. So I'm doing the same thing with the jeans. I've gone back to using the base colour, which I used the Imperial Blue, the Vallejo, and I've added that small bit of that titanium white into it just to create a highlight. So again, if you don't want to use the ink, by all means, mix in a little bit of white and try to build that tone up, and then we'll go from there. And it's all trial and error. See, the more that you do, the better you get, the more comfortable you feel. When your paint is nice and thin, what you find is the base color shows through as well, so you'd need multiple coats to keep highlighting it, and you can then get used to building those multiple layers, multiple coats, multiple highlights onto your miniatures as well. So again, it's all practice. The more you practice, the better you get, the more used to mixing you get and things like that. And sometimes mixing is good because you don't need to have like a million different paints in a paint range. Sometimes you might have one paint that you absolutely love and you think, oh, I wish I had a paint that would highlight that, but you can't find one. Well, you can make one. Just mix a little bit of white, mix a little bit of like a cream, like a bone white or things like that. Just build your layers up. So that was the first layer that I've used back onto the jeans, and as you can see, I've got a little bit of a mixed tone to the jeans now. So what I've done is I've added a little bit more of that white again, just to build up another highlight. So like I was showing you with the grey earlier, having one blob first, then two blobs for a second, so two little pipettes worth. And this is now just almost like an extreme highlight. So what I'm doing with this is I'm just going to catch the creases just to kind of make it look like a little bit of a washy effect. So it's almost like the colour is run, or the colour's not as extreme or faded in areas as well. There you go, just like that. So as I said, the more you do this, the better you get, the more used to it you get, and things like that. Everyone's got different techniques of the way that they paint, and everyone paints in different ways. This is just something that is useful to use the further into the painting that you go, and the further into painting miniatures you go. It's always useful to learn how to mix paints. Well, the reason why I've done it on this one to show you guys in a video is because mixing whites and blacks to lighten and darken is probably the easiest way to start learning how to mix paints and what paints will mix well together and what shades and colours you can get. So like I say, sometimes it's good to sit down and just play about with mixing a little bit of white to highlight, or a little bit of black to darken things down and use in the like creating your own washes and things like that, just so that you learn which colours suit and which way you can build those highlights and things. You know, by all means, I understand this isn't a technique that's going to be used or useful for everyone. It's not going to be a technique that everyone would want to use and paint as well, but hopefully this will be a little bit different, and hopefully it'll be quite a cool little painting video that will give you sort of a different way of painting and an option to paint in a different way as well, so you don't have to be stuck just doing the same routine all of the time. So once we've done all of those base coats, shades, then back to the base and then highlights on the clothing, we're going to look at doing the leathers. So I'm just going to add a little bit of leather brown onto the boots and onto the belt as well, just onto the belt strap here. Leather brown is a nice light brown. When this is nice and thin, applied on top of that dark rust, it does create a really nice deep colour between sort of the leather and the dark underneath. Just be careful not to paint his jacket by mistake like I did. So yeah, as you see, just using a nice thin coat of leather brown just to lighten those shoes up a little bit. And I think probably one of the final stages then, we're just going to add a very, very, very light dry brush onto that gun. So the easiest way to do a little gun like this is paint it a dark colour. It doesn't have to be a German grey, you can use a black if you want. And then to just dry brush very, very lightly the edges of it so that you get sort of a worn out effect. And there you go, that is Derek done. It's pretty much 3 colours essentially that I'm using an ink to highlight. So yeah, hopefully this will help you guys and hopefully it'll be a good video for you. And as always, thank you very, very much for watching.